In her newsletter, The Noösphere, journalist Katie Jgln just wrote an excellent essay about the gender gap in generative AI use, writing that generally women aren't swooning over generative AI the way that men are. And to me, this wasn't that shocking. But to a lot of people, including my students in my advertising aesthetics course, they weren't really sure what the difference was or how this actually happens. And I think it's really important for us to talk about what causes problems in generative AI and what are their issues in the data set, and especially reasons why we shouldn't be using it, all climate issues aside. And this is something that I think is really important to me. And a lot of this is connected to my project, Angry Boys Among Us, the history of the manosphere and how it affects media. One of the ways in which I connect this is through a tweet that went viral in August 2025 from conservative provocateur Richard Hanania. Hanania found this clip from Howard Stern's Butterface contest in 2004, a huge event that Howard Stern hosted in Las Vegas, where he had women volunteer to put bags over their heads, wear bikinis, and be judged by the audience and Howard Stern's staff. Now, regardless of what you think about Howard Stern's day, which is maybe completely different than he was in 2004, or maybe he's just as opportunistic to the way that media systems work now, but either way, I'm going to focus more on Hanania's quote that he wrote above this tweet. Because Hanania writes, "This was a different culture." And what I find fascinating about that is the past tense that Hanania puts in here. Because what he's really doing is laundering the idea that the misogyny of the early 2000s is no longer connected to the misogyny of the present. And I find that not only despicably wrong, but it is so fascinatingly wrong, especially in the context of generative AI and the way that the datasets operate in misogynistic bias. Katie Jgln's essay talks about a meta-analysis done by Harvard Business Review in which they analyzed 18 different studies of gender issues inside of the datasets and the use based on gender. And what they found is that women are 22% less likely to engage with generative AI tools. And Katie Jgln writes that the typical news coverage of this focuses on the way that gender disparities happen in work, that women typically aren't exposed to the tools as much based on the hegemonic biases of workplace use in general. But she points to something much more clear than that. It isn't that, it's about the technology itself that really affects women, especially their bodies and objectification of their bodies, that is much more disturbing to women, which causes them a little bit more hesitancy in using that. So in the early 2000s, misogyny was pretty much normalized, and it's been normalized since, well, forever. For the most of the history of consumer culture, women have been the primary aim of consumerism. That means marketers target women in particular to purchase items, and in many of the ways the patriarchal society is deemed because men are the breadwinners and women are the person to consume. And this shifted slightly in the 1990s, especially towards the end of the 1990s, when economic systems kind of normalized into their set ways and the young teen boy became a marketplace. But with the young men being targeted, including myself as an elder millennial, young women were much more objectified, but repurposed in a way that was different than the way that men were. Men were told that masculinity would be much more of a priority in marketing. But women were told to wear less clothing because that's empowerment, that the world had become safer for women, that the wave of feminism that happened in the 1980s, where women were able to wear pantsuits and compete in the marketplace, had now come to the place where women's bodies can be shown in safety now. They could wear less clothing and be less likely to be targeted, which was untrue, but that's how marketing works. And so Hanania's tweet is fascinating because the Butterface contest is cruel to begin with. It is a cruel event designed specifically to demean women. But what I found fascinating was that these women that are on this clip are objectively pretty women, and the comments section actually defends them quite vociferously. They make sure to let people know that this is a very odd event. Hanania doubles down over and over again to explain that this was a very specific moment in history that did this and that we've moved past it. Completely untrue, okay? That is what laundering looks like. So let's look at the way that generative AI reproduces all of the history of this, especially in the early 2000s masculine hegemony era. It's now been 3 years since OpenAI has launched ChatGPT and its generative AI systems. In those 3 years, the technology has increased its quality output, so the images are now much more photorealistic, and now you can put in a prompt and create video, motion picture, instead of just pictures. But the biases remain. The developers of generative AI and their datasets, Sam Altman and his ilk, use the open internet as the data source for the way that the large language models will work. And that means that the datasets are extremely biased for 2 reasons. 1, who developed the internet? Where does the data come from on the internet? And who is left out? Most importantly, you have to think that the internet is primarily developed by white men, that the people who input data or create media for the internet aren't exactly diverse. That means that the idea of diversity is lacking. So, for example, one of the things I always show my students is I use a prompt that says, show me a picture of a family eating spaghetti. I've been doing this prompt for 3 years, and for 3 straight years, it's produced a white family. And for 3 straight years, I've asked it, why do you show a white family? Now, just recently, the AI systems have become much more transparent and honest. The system then answers, well, there's biases in the data set. So when you ask for a family eating spaghetti, it's going to show a white family. And it says, helpfully, if you ask for it to show an African American family or an Asian family, it will distribute those, telling me that I must qualify my information. That means the default setting of the internet is white. So that means it's a white supremacist technology, because if the default setting is white, you must qualify everything that is non-white. Second to that is that women are automatically scraped in a way that generate them in a misogynistic manner, because the people who label the internet aren't typically thinking in a diverse manner. And this is based on the hegemony of digital technologies in general. Not just who is left out, but how do you get to categorize and create media online? In 2022, Melissa Heikkila wrote for the MIT Journalism Review an article about how Lensa, the app that hotified you, best way to describe it, it took a profile picture and turned you into a hot person, it took women's clothes off. It basically, when it generated a selfie, it didn't just generate their face, it generated their body, usually in a bikini or topless. And Melissa Heikkila asks, why did it do that, but it didn't do that to men? And the answer is pretty much self-explanatory, because inside the data set isn't just scraping the open web, but it's actually scraping the misogynistic biases built into the web, specifically the things that are problematic. Heikkila refers to an article about a team of researchers who investigated the Lion 400 dataset, the one that basically undergirds most of OpenAI's systems. And they write, what permeates the World Wide Web is a vast wasteland of poorly written, sparsely available alt-text image descriptions. This has attracted attention to accessibility advocates and ethicists alike, who have created a robust body of work that critically analyzes text and image-based description dyad. So to describe that to you, I'm going to use an example that I used in my class about how generative AI creates images. First off, it ingests a ton of data in order to create a large language model. And the data is across the scrape of the internet. Now you have to keep in mind that AI does not have eyes or ears. It cannot see. Everything in AI is math. It's just numbers. It is what we call tokens. Basically, when you ask it to turn a prompt, it turns each word into a token, sends it into the data set, and tries to retrieve it. Now, the way that does it is much the way that your predictive algorithm works for predictive text when you're texting. It's assuming what might be the best possible outcome for what you've asked for it. And the way it does that is as it averages all these tokens into one possible thing. The example I used in class was the word cat. Now, you have to assume that the internet is made mostly of cats. And so there's got to be a ton of cat images on the internet. But the reason why I use that example in particular is because cat is also a slur or a slang for a woman's body part. And so you have to remember that when people are generating images, it has to have the contextual ability to understand that when you ask for a cat, the word C-A-T, it's going to generate a small feline animal. But that's not the case in the way that the internet is labeled. Because the way that AI works means that it doesn't see cats. It doesn't know what a cat is. What it does is it looks across the internet at every word that a cat is labeled on image alt text. Alt text isn't exactly accurate because it requires the user to generate the context for the image, which isn't perfect because most internet users, A, don't make alt text, and B, many internet users who created the web and generally contextualize it didn't do it accurately at all. And because they come with personal biases in the system, they, in some cases, mislabeled things because they trolled it or they already had their biases built in. So when you ask for a cat, it basically goes through all these images and generates what it assumes is that based on the general collection of images that are correct. So it requires people who build the LLMs to basically sift through the data and remove the women's body parts and remove the parts that aren't cats, so it only has cats left in it. But that only takes a small example of what must be curated to make something unbiased, because biases exist solidly in the system. The researchers continue. In the section called Misogyny and Stereotypes, the researchers write, upon querying the search portal with non-NSFW queries, we encountered a significantly high ratio of NSFW results that contained vivid descriptions of sexual violence and other troubling imagery. Even the weakest link to womanhood, or some aspect of what was traditionally conceived as feminine, returned pornographic imagery. The sample images reveal how the specific semantic search engine version meant to fetch images from Line 400M not only risked amplifying hypersexualized and misogynic representation of women, but also presented results that were reminiscent of Anglo-centric, Eurocentric, and potentially white supremacist ideologies. So for Richard Hanania to basically say this was the culture is explicitly wrong, because in the data set of the internet, it literally is the culture. It is the data culture. It is the culture of images. Generative AI is basically a reality engine. And what I mean by that is that generative AI is basically replacing search. People are asking it because it's much more conversational, it's more casual, and requires far less thinking. With search, you have to make a judgment call and figure out what is the proper thing that you're looking for and making sure you get the right output. Whereas generative AI basically uses a static data set, meaning it's not looking into the future, it's looking into the past because the data set is locked, and retrieving the information it best thinks fits the query. It isn't a search engine at all. That said, the enshittification of Google, where everything is an ad now and it can be gamed fully by SEO and the garbage of the internet, doesn't really give me hope as to why people would stay away from generative AI or GPT as a search engine. It kind of makes sense because people don't want to be using an enshittified product. But this also tells you that these reality engines develop what we assume as normal. It normalizes this behavior. And when Hanania said it was a different culture because that type of misogyny was normalized, that type of misogyny continues to be normalized, but now in big data sets. While television normalized that in the sense that women could walk around in bikinis and bags over their heads and be judged by the audience, now it just happens in data. In fact, one of the things that were most disturbing is the fact that the reason why women are less likely to use generative AI is because they're very aware of deepfake systems, the systems of AI that basically allow users, any user, to take their head, put it into a system, and nudify them. There are over 400 deepfake nudify apps that exist out there that allow people to take any image from the internet and turn a woman into a naked person, objectifying their body. So it isn't even about the bag over the head and the bikini any longer. It's now about the fact you could just do that using a tool that enables it. And what that tells me most is that the aesthetics of the manosphere have become the culture. Because the aesthetics of the manosphere, that greasy, slimy look that almost looks slightly wet of digital technologies, it's not CG, but it's also not cartoon that AI represents. This sweaty look is designed specifically almost as a fascistic endeavor, something that tells me that there is an inside and outside to the culture they want to present. The idea that women are basically standardized as data, as objectified data, that there is only a body type that is acceptable, the acceptable body type that allows them to basically judge a woman based on what the output is and not their whole self. This leads me to two outcomes that are really important. One, we should encourage people to learn much more about the biases built into these data sets. The fact that the manosphere is basically operating them vehemently is something that we should warn people about. The danger to young women in particular is immense. And we have to remember that just them being on the internet means that they're susceptible to being manipulated by AI data. Second, it's like we have to remind people consistently of the fact that it's constantly drinking water and using electricity to create these types of images. And that thing is dangerous to our future regardless. The mainstream wants to basically say that this is just an access issue, that this is an issue where women just don't have enough access to generative AI tools, because most of our marketing for generative AI is pro-AI. It is designed specifically to tell you that you're just not using it properly. That's why you're not using it. In fact, I find many people who look back at me and get mad at me for my critiques of AI kind of think that it's just because I'm not using it right. I've been an AI literacy person since it's come out, and I've been studying deepfakes since 2017 or 2018. So this is my area of expertise. It's not like I'm just not happy with the technology. It's the fact that I'm aware that these systems are broken. And these systems are broken, and when Sam Altman basically says, well, he needs the money to make it better, he's just saying he has a garbage product. That's all he's saying. And we really have to encourage people to find other ways to interact with these products, or at least at the best case, try to make sure we break these repetitive systems, these things that allow culture to continually cause women to be objectified. Because if we don't, we enable this normalization. And while I'm very hopeful, because the comments section of Richard Tanania's tweet is all these people who basically are defending these young women and saying, but they're pretty, this isn't it. One thing to remember is that we can't go backward. We can't undo the knowledge that women were treated this way. So at least we know now how to be more respectful. But the technologists that embed these biases in the system, they are the same young men who watched that and felt that is normal and want you to be assured that this is normal now. Because in 20 years from now, when somebody looks back at the horrors of AI and tweets to you and says, this was a different culture, you should better hope that's true.